Long before the first English colonists set foot in North America, a dark chapter in human history had already begun across the Atlantic Ocean. When Christopher Columbus sailed westward in 1492, he did not simply discover new lands. He set in motion a system of exploitation that would reshape the world for centuries to come. Hoping to return to his Spanish patrons, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, with treasures of gold, Columbus instead offered them something he deemed equally valuable: human beings as slaves. The royal couple initially hesitated, troubled by the morality of enslaving people who had committed no offense against Spain. They ordered Columbus to cease his activities until theologians and legal counselors could determine the rightness of such actions. But Columbus, driven by ambition and the promise of wealth, ignored their commands entirely. By 1495, he had shipped over 500 enslaved indigenous people from the West Indies to Spain, forcing them into a brutal trade that would only grow more systematic and devastating with each passing year. Between 1493 and 1496, Columbus established what became known as the encomienda system throughout the lands he had claimed for Spain. Under this arrangement, Spanish settlers received vast tracts of land along with the indigenous people living there, who were forced to work the fields in exchange for meager provisions and supposed protection from their new masters. Though Ferdinand and Isabella eventually outlawed slavery within Spain itself and demanded the freedom of those who had been brought there, they nonetheless legalized both slavery and the encomienda system in their New World colonies, creating a legal foundation for centuries of human bondage. By the time English colonists established their first permanent settlement at Jamestown in 1607, the transatlantic slave trade had become an established enterprise among European powers. The Spanish and Portuguese had been systematically transporting enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples for over a century, developing routes and markets that would later be adopted by the Dutch, French, and finally the English. The earliest English colonists in Virginia viewed the Powhatan Confederacy natives as yet another resource to be exploited, regularly stealing from them, and according to reports from as early as 1610, already taking them as slaves. A pivotal moment arrived in 1619 when a Dutch ship, its supplies dangerously depleted during its voyage, put into port at Jamestown carrying approximately 20 enslaved Africans. Governor Yeardley traded provisions to the Dutch captain in exchange for these men and women, marking the arrival of the first recorded Africans in English colonial America. Yet these individuals were not immediately condemned to perpetual bondage. Instead, they were treated as indentured servants, working for their masters for a term of 4 to 7 years before being granted their own land to cultivate, just as white indentured servants were. Among those first Africans was a man who would later be known as Anthony Johnson. Unlike the brutal fate that would befall millions who came after him, Johnson completed his term of servitude and became a freeman. By 1640, colonial records list him as a landowner who had even purchased a slave of his own, a man named John Cassar. This brief window of possibility, however, was about to close forever, sealing the fate of countless generations through a single legal case that would define American slavery for the next 2 centuries. In 1640, everything changed with a man named John Punch. An indentured servant of African descent, Punch objected to his harsh treatment and fled his master's plantation alongside 2 white indentured servants seeking similar freedom. When the 3 men were captured and returned, the colonial court handed down dramatically different sentences that would echo through history. The two white servants received their punishment, 4 additional years of servitude. But John Punch, because of the color of his skin, was sentenced to serve his master for the remainder of his natural life. This moment marked the birth of racialized slavery in English colonial America, transforming bondage from a temporary condition into a permanent, hereditary status. Throughout the 1660s, the Virginia colony systematically passed laws that stripped away the rights of Africans, creating a comprehensive legal framework for racial slavery. These statutes restricted movement, prohibited gatherings, and established harsh punishments for any perceived disobedience. What had begun as individual acts of exploitation now became institutionalized policy, with the full weight of colonial law transformed into chains. By the end of the decade, the enslavement of Africans and their descendants was no longer a question of individual circumstances, but an inescapable reality determined solely by ancestry and the color of one's skin. While Virginia established its system of bondage, the New England colonies to the north were developing their own relationship with slavery. The Pequot Wars of 1636 to 1638 ended with colonial victory, and the systematic enslavement and deportation of Pequot tribal members, many of whom were shipped to Caribbean plantations. Massachusetts Bay Colony codified slavery in 1641, defining it as lawful when applied to war captives, criminals, or foreigners already enslaved by others and sold to colonists. The northern colonies may not have relied as heavily on slave labor as their southern counterparts, but they were no less complicit in the institution. Even in Pennsylvania, founded on Quaker principles that would eventually oppose slavery, the practice took root. In 1688, a group of Quakers drafted a petition condemning slavery and submitted it to the colonial government, but their moral plea was simply filed away and forgotten until it was rediscovered over a century and a half later. By 1703, New York City's slave population comprised 42% of the total population, and a slave market operated openly on Wall Street along the East River. New York also enacted some of the harshest laws in the colonies, including the death penalty for enslaved people who killed or rebelled against their masters. The engine that drove this system of bondage was the triangle trade, a cyclical exchange of goods and human cargo between 3 continents. European ships departed laden with textiles, metals, alcohol, and weapons, sailing to the western coast of Africa, where these goods were traded for enslaved human beings. These captives then endured the horrific Middle Passage across the Atlantic, packed into ship holds so tightly they could barely move, with over half expected to die before reaching the Americas. Those who survived the journey were sold in colonial ports, and the ships returned to Europe carrying sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other commodities produced by slave labor, completing the triangle and generating enormous wealth for merchants and traders. Conditions during the Middle Passage defied human comprehension. Enslaved people were forced to lie on their sides in what captains called spoon fashion to conserve space. A fully grown man received a space 18 inches wide and 6 feet long. Women received slightly less, and children even smaller allotments. Lord Palmerston observed that they had less room than a corpse in a coffin. The British Parliament attempted to regulate the trade by limiting the number of slaves per ship tonnage, but captains routinely ignored these laws in their pursuit of profit. In darkness, filth, and unimaginable suffering, millions made this terrible journey, and millions more died in the attempt. In the southern colonies, slavery evolved into its most extensive and brutal form. Large tobacco, rice, and cotton plantations required vast amounts of manual labor, and plantation owners turned increasingly to enslaved Africans to meet this demand. The slave codes of Barbados, systematized in 1661, became the template for southern colonies, particularly South Carolina. These codes mandated that enslaved people could not leave plantations without written permission, prohibited them from playing musical instruments or making loud noises that might signal rebellion, and encouraged whites to stop and search any black person on the street without cause. The codes even offered rewards to enslaved people who informed on their fellows, attempting to sow distrust within the enslaved community itself. The plantation owners lived in constant fear that their enslaved majority would rise up against them, and this terror shaped every aspect of Southern society. By 1660, enslaved people outnumbered free whites in Barbados, and similar ratios eventually developed in parts of Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas. The memory of early rebellions, particularly Bacon's Rebellion of 1676, when black and white servants united and burned Jamestown to the ground, haunted the colonial elite. They responded with a system of strict surveillance and savage punishment, transforming behaviors previously tolerated into capital crimes. Enslaved people accused of fomenting rebellion faced hanging or burning at the stake, often with little evidence beyond the paranoid suspicions of their masters. On the 9th of September, 1739, the largest slave revolt in colonial history erupted near the Stone River in South Carolina. Led by an enslaved man named Cotto, also known as Jimmy, 22 enslaved people raided a warehouse for weapons and began marching south toward Spanish Florida, where they had heard they would find freedom. As they marched, they attacked plantation houses and killed their white masters, and their numbers swelled to at least 100 as others joined their desperate bid for liberty. The colonial militia eventually caught up with the rebels and a fierce battle ensued, resulting in the deaths of dozens on both sides. The rebellion was crushed, and executions continued throughout the rest of the year, with little regard for legal proceedings or actual guilt. When the American Revolution erupted in 1775 with its stirring rhetoric of liberty and justice, many enslaved people dared to hope that freedom would extend to them as well. They heard white colonists speak passionately about ending oppression and establishing a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal. Some enslaved men even fought in the Continental Army, serving in place of their masters with promises of freedom as their reward. But when the cannons fell silent and independence was won, the chains of slavery remained firmly in place. The new nation, conceived in liberty, maintained the institution of human bondage, exposing a fundamental hypocrisy that would poison American democracy for generations. The northern states gradually began abolishing slavery by 1850, influenced by the growing abolitionist movement, and aided by the fact that their economies relied less heavily on slave labor than the agrarian South. Industrialization further reduced the North's dependence on slavery. But the Southern states clung fiercely to what they euphemistically called their peculiar institution, arguing that their entire way of life and economic prosperity depended upon it. The divide between free and slave states deepened until the nation could no longer contain the contradiction. And in 1861, the American Civil War began, a conflict that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives before finally bringing slavery to its legal end. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring freedom for enslaved people in the Confederate States. 2 years later, after the Confederacy's defeat, The 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery throughout the United States. 4 million people stepped out of bondage into an uncertain freedom. Yet the end of legal slavery did not erase the deep scars it had carved into American society. The systemic racism that slavery had institutionalized persisted in new forms: segregation, discrimination, unequal justice, and economic disparity. The descendants of those who were enslaved would continue fighting for the freedom and equality that had been promised but never fully delivered, a struggle that continues to shape America into the present day. Enjoyed learning about this crucial period of American history? Give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more fascinating historical deep dives. We explore the stories that shaped our world, bringing history to life one episode at a time. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next journey through time. See you in the next one.